My name is Brian Stevenson. I am the director and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. I think most people would be surprised most by the way our criminal justice system tolerates mistakes, how it's defined by error. We have a system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. We have a system where hundreds of people are potentially on death row for crimes they didn't commit. Thousands of people are serving long prison sentences for crimes they didn't commit. Half of the prison population is mentally disabled. And we have put people in jail and prisons not because they're a threat to public safety, but because they're poor, they're disabled, they're vulnerable, they're people of color. And I think that's the thing that most surprises people when they begin looking more closely at the way our criminal justice system functions.
Welcome to Writings, Chats, and Friends. Today, Celeste, Ken, and I are so very happy to have one of our favorite guests back with us today. And we're going to talk about something that I think is important to everyone, and that is justice. And Ken, I understand you have something to share with us also.
Yes. Before I do, though, I should mention, folks, our guest today is Dr. Michael Phillips,
yes,
historian and teacher and educator, and tilter at monuments. He's helped knock down quite a few.
This is true, and actually had some success. Not as much as I wanted, but we've made progress.
Every little bit helps.
Right.
I thought I'd start today with this poem from Lawrence Ferlingetti, who recently passed. And I don't know about other people, but for me, it was one of my favorite contemporary poets. I guess since he died at age 101, and I'm saying he's a contemporary poet, I'm kind of aging myself. But, but this is one of my favorites of his. The world is a beautiful place to be born into, if you don't mind happiness not always being so very much fun. If you don't mind a touch of hell now and then, just when everything is fine, because even in heaven, they don't sing all the time. The world is a beautiful place to be born into. If you don't mind some people dying all the time, or maybe only starving some of the time, which isn't half so bad if it isn't you. Oh, the world is a beautiful place to be born into if you don't much mind a few dead minds in the higher places, or a bomb or two now and then in your upturned faces, or such other inapproprieties as our brand name society is prey to with its men of distinction and its men of extinction and its priests and other patrolmen and its various segregations and congressional investigations and other constipations that our fool flesh is heir to. Yes, the world is the best place of all for a lot of such things as making the fun scene and making the love scene and making the sad scene and singing low songs and having inspirations and walking around looking at everything and smelling flowers and goosing statues and even thinking and kissing people and making babies and wearing pants and waving hats and dancing and going swimming in rivers on picnics in the middle of the summer and just generally living it up. Yes. But then, right in the middle of it comes the smiling mortician.
You're never ready for that.
I have to say that City Lights Bookstore is one of my favorite places. And there's some great Italian restaurants there in the North Beach area in San Francisco. And I'll age myself. There's a Martin Scorsese film called The Last Waltz, which is about a band called The Band. And
yes.
there's a riveting scene there where Lawrence Ferlinghetti reads one of his poems, and it's one of the memorable moments from that particular thing. I got to meet Allen Ginsberg a couple of times, and so that period really fascinates me of literature, that period of literature. So
I kind of thought the beats would speak to you, Michael, as they do to me.
Yeah.
So today's topic is justice. And I picked that poem because it does raise a lot, the power and and all these things. So let's start with, what is justice? Anybody want to kick off with that simple answer to that one?
Well, I think obviously justice would be that every person has obstacles cleared from their path to achieve what they're capable of doing. Justice would be that people who inflict harm in society are held to account, but that we recognize also the basic humanity of every person. That we see when we dispense justice, that we see it as a moment of learning, not a moment of retribution. However, we do have to hold people accountable. And I think one of the things we have to deal with right now is we've been through 5 years of horror. Mm-hmm. I think unambiguously, the instigation of our worst instincts in terms of racism, the widening gap of the life experience from people who are poor, working class, and people who are rich, the appalling indifference to mass death during COVID. We have to hold people accountable. They have to face justice. And Americans are very quick to embrace amnesia, just try to move. Okay, that's over. Let's move past it. And we paid for that. One thing that reminds me about this period, culminating with the January 6th rebellion, is in some ways it reminds me of the period after the Civil War during Reconstruction, when we had so many horrors committed upon African Americans during the period of slavery. We had an act of treason that killed 700,000. By the way, who knows? We might approach that in COVID deaths. Yeah. And we didn't hold anyone accountable. The people who led that treasonous rebellion, who enslaved other human beings, were never held to account. And in fact, one reason why you alluded to the monuments issue, the Confederate monument, I've fought to take those down. Those are the people who, instead of facing justice, were hailed as heroes, because we chose to lie about that period because it made us feel bad about ourselves. We don't want to confront the fact that a great deal of evil is at the core of the American experience, and that much of American wealth is built on human misery and exploitation. Justice requires confronting that and actively taking the steps to undo the evil that has been at the heart of the American experience. That was long-winded, but that's
great. Yeah, I love the
Michael, I think one reason we have a huge problem with justice is it's a money-making industry, and people are depending on
You're talking about the courts and the criminal justice.
Yes, that part of the justice.
And the prisons and the police and
the prison system. Yeah, I mean, there are so many people that are in prison for the most minor things, like possessing marijuana, or they are innocent, but they can't afford a good attorney, so they get whoever is given to them, and they end up in jail.
No, I mean, it's travesty or capital crime, trying to get someone to pay for the DNA evidence, and even when DNA evidence that is exculpatory is available, sometimes the justice system won't listen. It is extraordinary. Corporations literally get away with murder. I tell I tell my students about the Ford Pinto, to age myself again. The car that burst into flames went from behind.
Minor accident.
And the Ford Motor Company concealed information, and they never paid a price. When corporations kill people, the executives aren't made to march in orange jumpsuits. They don't have to do the perp walk where they put the hat in front of their face, and they walk to the squad car and then they're made, that doesn't happen. So the justice system is a justice system built on two things. Number one, wealth, as you say. You have a different justice system if you're wealthy. Lawyers are extraordinarily expensive. I don't know if we have, this isn't really directly on topic. I'm fighting a free speech battle in my college. And so I had to pony up to get representation on First Amendment issues at my college. And it's hard because the college has vast resources, but it's worth the battle. And it's built fundamentally on racism. The society depends on the average person in the white community feeling like they're in a competition for scarce resources with African Americans, and to intensify that sense of not just competition, but life or death struggle, to make African Americans in the popular imagination feel or appear dangerous. And so much of our criminal justice system, we had, based on that phobia, that fundamental anti-Black phobia that so much of white society is built on, we just vastly expanded a number of things that are illegal, that economically devastates Black neighborhoods when wage earners are imprisoned. It breaks up families, and then Black families get lectured, why aren't your families intact? The criminal justice system breaks up the families.
And no one ever talks about that.
We have to remember how often when whites perpetrate violence against Blacks, then of course the criminal justice system disappears. I'm thinking of like Tulsa, the infamous, massacre of not just innocent, but hardworking, middle-class, Black, business-owning Black people who just, we want that, we want your wealth, let's kill you. And nobody is ever held accountable on that end. And, even up into modern times, how few of the people who have been involved in bombing Black churches, things like that, have been held accountable.
Let's be blunt. Police are not held accountable when they murder Black and brown people. They just aren't. And it doesn't matter what the videotape is. And those recordings, the first time I remember it having a big impact is Rodney King in Los Angeles. But it's so much more ubiquitous now because of the cell phones.
Right.
That provides concrete evidence of a criminal act on the part of so-called law enforcement. But it's such a Rorschach test. You show white people that recording and they see something completely different. They see what they want to. And God knows how many cases haven't been recorded on cell phone.
Mike, I want to interrupt you for a minute because Celeste, you are a person of color, and I'm wondering, we're sitting here, we're talking about how outrageously, how justice in this country is defined as being in some way an attack on people of color. And I'm wondering what some of your thoughts are.
Wow, so many levels on this conversation here. It's kind of interesting. I became a TikTok person recently because my daughter put me on TikTok, and actually I'm learning a lot on TikTok. But it was an interesting, I'm in a couple of Asian American groups. There's some Asian American and African American groups, and now there's a few Latino and Black groups back east more than out west. And the conversation was interesting because an Asian lady said, she said, I've read about Black Wall Street, and I want to know how did Black people become prosperous in the era of Jim Crow? And it was kind of interesting that she said that, because it reminded me of how deep racism has gone to the point of even stereotyping a group of people with other nationalities. And it's really very deep and ingrained, even in the Black community. We, in a lot of ways, we don't see ourselves as being affiliated with women's groups or Latino groups, or we probably associate more with Native Americans than we do anything else. But I think the whole thing of making Blacks look like they don't count, not being part of the history of the United States, history not being correct, stereotyping by the way you talk to other cultures about Black people has really done a job. And now, even to the point, it gets to be very frustrating, because where there's some of us that really want to fight this and change things, it's kind of like where you start. There's so much, it's like, where do you start? And then there's also the conversation can become very confusing when we're talking to whites, because the whole, I disagreed with the whole Black Lives Movement when they were saying defund the police, because it was the wrong word to use.
It was the word, yeah.
The word became such a negative thing with everybody because no one understood what that meant. And so now we can't even go correct it now because no one wants to listen about what it actually means. So you not only have where we want to try to correct things, but you have Black groups that are not coming together. Okay, you have a real disconnect with a lot of the Black groups, and that doesn't make it any better. Okay,
can we move toward justice in America if we keep talking even about Black groups, Latino groups, women's groups?
Absolutely. I believe that we still people, that we have the power to make the changes, but it is going to be. It's not going to be just the Black people, not just the white people. It's going to be people, period. Yeah. I mean, look at what we did in the vote. And I think that in that same respect, we can go about doing anything if we could come together and find the common ground. Like I always say, when we have conversations with my friends and they'll say, well, I don't want to talk about this. It makes me mad. And I'm saying, but you got to talk until you got to go through the anger, even if you're talking. You got to go through the anger before you can get to the solution. You got to go through the anger before we can even listen to each other. And I think but I do think we can change it. I'm very confident right now this year. I'm very confident because so many things have been exposed. And not only exposed is that now people are saying, okay, well, why did they do that? I was watching the video that you did with talking about COVID, and one of the things I thought about when the whole testing thing came out was there were no testing in the areas where there were minorities. All the testing places were in areas where either we weren't going to get to, or we're not going to go on that side of town. Period. Okay.
Well, that's interesting because there was another story just recently, and I think to kind of focus us in on COVID for a minute, because it really is a test of our of the equality, that myth of equality. Not too long ago, in California, they created a system to make sure that people in less affluent areas, which meant primarily Black and Hispanic people, would have access to the vaccines. And they created a code, which then was widely disseminated among wealthy whites, who then went to the injection sites with the code and got the vaccine that was intended to be reserved to make it more equitable. So one of the issues we have in this country, obviously, is can we ever have justice? Can we ever have justice without wealth equality? Michael, what do you think about that?
Well, I want to talk about COVID for a second first, because in Texas, it's worse. we have a governor who prioritized, in terms of COVID vaccines, rural areas. And when you say rural, you're talking about much larger white population and Republican voting areas. We have a Republican governor. There actually was an attempt in Dallas, and I live near Dallas, to set up more vaccination sites in the southern sector of Dallas, which is a very much a Black population there.
Mm-hmm.
And the governor, his administration said, if you do that, we'll cut vaccine allocations to all of Dallas. We'll punish you for.
Oh my word!
And bear in mind, economic equality is overlaps. We have a tendency to disentangle economic justice and racial justice. We know that African Americans and Latinx, the Latinx community, tend to be the frontline workers.
Right.
They tend to work in the jobs where they have face-to-face contact with people who might be carrying the virus. Plus, they've been exposed to environmental racism. They've been exposed to low quality of healthcare. Period. They're overworked, and so they have all these added risk factors that make them more vulnerable. And then you punish prioritizing Black and brown people for vaccinations. I've called it passive genocide. It's not necessarily aimed at the complete extermination. You don't have death squads shooting people. You simply let people die by doing nothing. When their health is at risk, and prioritizing white people. This is the thing we have to remember. Why does racism exist? And I would argue the fundamental reason is it serves to divide people who have so much in common against a common enemy, which is, let's be blunt, the wealthy.
Right.
That you divide the white working class against Black people. Is the white working class really in charge of their lives? Well, guess what? We found out, the boss wants you to go work, in a place where you're going to be exposed to COVID. He doesn't care about you. Your white skin doesn't matter anymore. But the fact is, if you focus the rage on African Americans and see them as job competition, or somehow they're getting something that you deserve, and like the criminal justice system, a poor white person will have worse outcomes in any kind of legal case than a rich white person was. But if they get stopped by the police, they're far more likely to not get shot to death.
Oh, absolutely.
And so those are privileges. Not getting shot to death by the police.
Right.
It's terrible.
But there are a lot of privileges.
Yeah, they're all kinds of
privileges. Very real.
You're not going to be followed around when you go to a convenience store, right? You're more likely to live in a neighborhood that has something other than a convenience store to get food. You're not going to live in a food desert as often. Yeah. There's a terror of losing those privileges, which aren't insignificant, but still leave you pretty much disenfranchised and powerless. You don't want to fall to the bottom. That's fundamentally why racism exists. It benefits, whether it was conscious or it just evolved. It's a social system that serves to take, the phrase, the 1%, take that 99% and chop it into smaller segments that are mutually antagonistic. White people need to learn something, though, that even poor white people, I grew up in a poor household, we fundamentally still have it easier than Black people do, even Black people who are wealthier than we are. And that is, if we're going to have justice, we have to confront that fact. And we have to really discuss whether or not we need to pursue the redistribution of wealth, that with the distribution of wealth we have now, whether that serves anyone but the very few at the top. And I think overwhelming evidence is that capitalism, as we understand it, is literally killing the planet. We were just in, this just became an ice box because the Arctic vortex is collapsing. That's our great oil and gas industry that Texans love so much. And it killed people. People froze to death. can we sustain this? And if we dismantle, we have to bear in mind that it's not just economic justice, but it's racial justice. The two things are twinned.
And environmental justice. And environmental justice. You know,
Right.
I wanted to just bring something up here because I think it really is very true of what you're saying. And Monica, you are a very good example of how the American justice system really does crap on the middle class white population, because you're living up there in Paradise, California. What an ironic name. And
It used to be.
the aftermath of the campfire, which we've talked about before. And here we see where the whole system, even when it's trying to help, and I'm going to say, like, I think that to some degree, the federal government tried to help, to some degree, the local governments have tried to help. And even in that, it ends up that the electric company that caused the damage really is the one that they end up helping most.
Yeah, they let them do bankruptcy, and they don't care what happened to any individual. They are going to use a scale, and everybody's going to get the same no matter what happened,
Right.
according to their scale.
Yeah, they're created.
On top of that, we are now paying for their insurance.
Yeah, your rates are going up.
Yeah. So what kind of justice is that?
Speaking of rates going up and how, let's talk about now, just move to another environmental disaster, which Mike, you mentioned, the vortex collapse and the freeze in Texas recently. I don't know about your electric bills, but I understand some of the folks there in Texas are getting like $7,000 bills for a week's worth of electricity.
16,000.
And it's a product of deregulation, and Texas seceding, and that word is so weighted anyway, so fraught with meaning, basically seceding from the rest of the power grid in the country, except for El Paso, right? That part of the state
Right.
is connected to the Western electric grid. And so because of deregulation, these companies were not required to weatherize their equipment, and they try to blame it on green energy, which would be actually a way to prevent these kind of events happening in the future.
Isn't it crazy?
The wind turbines were frozen, supposedly. Well, guess what? It was oil and gas and coal. All of that was primarily involved with the collapse of our energy system. And we were within 4 hours, or actually closer, of a total collapse of our energy system. The most oil and maybe the center of the petrochemical industry in the world, or at least in the United States, from this going on for weeks and weeks. We would have been spending months repairing the damage if this had, we were that close to that kind of catastrophic event. And it's a sad thing, because any economy that depends heavily on those kind of extractive industries generally has giant wealth inequality, generally has a large percentage of people who have less educational opportunities, poor health outcomes everywhere. It's like it's a modern version of the cotton plantation economy, where it benefits very few at the very top, and there's a substrata that's involved in management, but generally those resources don't get invested back into the larger society.
Right.
Well, what's kind of interesting that you're saying about Texas, I understand they're getting ready that people are getting together to do a lawsuit, but my daughter lives in Frisco, Texas, and my brother lives there. Right, my brother lives in Dallas. So my brother, he was off for 5 days because he drives truck. My daughter lives right across the street from the Dallas Cowboys complex, so she didn't have a lot of issues that people have, because the complex she lives in is actually kind of a place where usually a lot of rich people come and live there while they're getting their houses built in Frisco.
Right.
So it was kind of interesting because her ex-husband lived in the next building over, same complex now, same complex, just the lower income folks lived across the street, and he actually had to come stay with my daughter because they had rolling blackouts over there. So
How about that?
kind of interesting to see.
Coincidence?
Yeah.
Frisco is in Collin County, and I live in Plano, the same county.
Right.
And you know, it's a 10-minute drive for me to that town. And we did Jim Crow the electric grid in some ways, you know, because you know, they were prioritizing where the lights would stay on. There's a place in Dallas, it's not actually in the city, it's called Highland Park. And it's an enclave, super rich people, and it's its own city, but it's completely separate. It's surrounded by Dallas. It's a little island of rich people. They don't pay Dallas taxes. They have their own police department, which harasses Black and brown people, by the way. Southern Methodist University is located there, and they have always had this exploitive relationship, and they dominate Dallas politics, even though they're not Dallas. Like Highland Park, the lights were on 24/7.
One of the things we have to be aware of, you know, and I want to get, is this, that it is a gradient, and that, yes, we have the very wealthy who are getting on, and then there are the people who support the very wealthy, namely the police and the military. And we are moving in a direction much like what you see in places like North Korea, where you have a military that is supporting this absolutely incredible authoritarian tyranny, and because they feel that they are getting so much better, and they don't want to lose any of what they get. And so what we have is a very interesting, it's not trickle-down economics, but it is a sort of more like how you might feed your dogs, your watchdogs. You know, if you live on a nice estate, if you're a dog on a nice estate, and you're one of the Rottweilers whose job it is to patrol the fences to keep the proles out of the estate, you get a really good meal.
Right.
You get a nice doghouse.
Well, if we could go back briefly to the defund the police issue. If I'd been in charge of the movement, if there had been one person doing that, I might have said reimagine policing or something like that. But I understand the point, because we have to think about what the police, American policing, was based on. Number one, slave patrols.
Yeah.
That's right.
Number two, and this is less acknowledged because we don't talk about the class system in America. We ignore it. We talk about race rather than class. That's the alchemy that race performs, is people who are poor identify with rich people who are the same racial group. Right? You know, poor whites identify more with rich white people than with African Americans who are struggling too. The police primarily were there to protect the property of rich white people. They became the goon squads for the robber barons, Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller, people like that. They were there with guns blazing when there was a strike. Coal mines. They would kill the miners who went on strike. I mean, people like Rockefeller were literally responsible for massacres, and that doesn't end up in public school textbooks. It's true, and the police were there as a tool. And so we have people who are ostensibly working class. A lot of police officers are, but they have been co-opted to defend a system that ultimately robs them.
And ultimately, one of the tricks of it, except for blacks because of the racial issue, but one of the tricks of it was that policing would often be to divide the community itself. So when, for example, in New York, with an influx of Irish working class, they got a lot of Irish cops in there. It was like divide rather than have solidarity among. The only group that I think really you could say has not, the policing in this country is really deliberately excluded from that process is blacks, because of course the first thing has always been the slave patrols.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I talk about something that has a lot to do with justice?
Sure.
And that's presidential pardons.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
How can it be justice when a president can pardon over 100 felons, some of them horrible felons that should never be out of jail again, and yet allow the people that really need a pardon to just go by the wayside? How can we let that happen?
Well, there's
over 100 criminals let loose.
well, there's a famous man, Leonard Peltier, who was most likely wrongly convicted of killing law enforcement, and I think it's been since the 1970s.
Right.
He's been in prison, and it doesn't matter Democrat or Republican, they won't pardon him because they want police to vote for them. That's essentially it. And he's dark skinned, therefore, the empathy isn't there on part of the general public. The founders who are hyped so much had a lot of bad ideas.
That was one of them.
The U.S. Senate was a bad idea. The Electoral College was a bad idea. And presidential pardon power was a bad idea, because if a president pardons everyone in a circle, he doesn't have to pardon himself. I don't know if you remember the first George H.W. Bush, was involved in a scandal called Iran-Contra.
Yes.
And he spent the last few hours of his presidency pardoning every major figure.
Yeah.
And killed any investigation into his role. So Trump's abuse of the pardon power, that's not unique to Trump.
No, but all of it should be illegal.
Yeah. And we should appeal. One thing we could do if we want to maintain that, because a president possibly could look at a corrupt justice system where, evidence was faked by the police, planted by the police, the DA was complicit, et cetera, and give relief that way, because the local justice system doesn't work. But what we have to at least do is limit the pardon power, saying you can't pardon yourself, explicitly say that. Number two, say you can't pardon members of your administration. You can't pardon members of your family, because the conflict of interest in all of those cases, that would take an amendment. But I think we need that clarification, and we need to severely restrict presidential pardon power, because it really isn't used very often for the purpose I just described. Oh, this person was railroaded by the system.
Yeah, and that's what its intent was.
You should also not be able to pardon somebody who has not been convicted. You kind of anticipate you shouldn't be able to pardon.
Absolutely.
Might as well say you're guilty if you pardon someone.
I think for the most part, pardons have not been used for those reasons. And there is a good cause to have some kind of pardoning system. And of course, it goes back to the royal prerogatives. We have to remember the founding fathers, and to the small degree that Abigail Adams, for example, got hurt, mothers, what they had in mind was really, you have to remember, it wasn't, oh, we're creating this entirely new system. It was based on something that they were familiar with and trying to improve it. The thing is, I find horrifying a lot of the time is that people are still unwilling to realize, hey, even though it's been amended all these times, even though we had prohibition and then, had this, all of these things that have had to be changed, still most people, especially those who are buying into the injustice system, but this is our founding, this is the Constitution, this is what we believe, instead of saying, what the founding fathers really did recognize, which was that it was not necessarily a system for all time, that it needed to be amended. In fact, they went on and immediately created 10 amendments.
Well, one thing I would say is I always remember John Dean when he was, Richard Nixon's legal counsel. He had that conversation in the White House where he says, there's a cancer on the presidency. I do think in some ways the presidency itself has become a cancer, that by default, because Congress has become so dysfunctional, and because the Senate has become such an obstacle to any progress, that by default, the presidency has metastasized like a tumor in terms of its power. And it's been bipartisan, if Obama orders a drone strike against someone he thinks is a terrorist, but there's been no due process, and the drone falls and it not only kills the suspect, but everyone around them. George Bush got the power to declare people enemy combatants, and they're put in Guantanamo Bay with no access. They don't even have the right of habeas corpus. If you have presidents, my students are stunned. I ask them every semester, when was the last time the United States declared war against another country? Some of them say, well, World War II, say 1942. We declared war on Hitler's allies, not the big three Axis powers, but Hungary and that was 79 years ago. Well, we've had some wars since then.
Quite a few.
And it's the Congress can declare a resolution that they renew over and over again. We're going to support the troops, but they get the best of both worlds. If the military adventure, and we're constantly military adventures, if it goes well, they can take credit. But if they go bad, they say, well, I didn't know he was going to do that just because I gave him all the money for the invasion, and just because I keep authorizing the spending in Iraq or Afghanistan. They don't pay any price. And it's hard to have a just society when we have by default granted that much power to one institution. We have to be very cautious about that and not fall into thinking only in terms of Republican and Democrat, because the office itself has become dangerous. And we saw what happens when someone like Trump has that office. It becomes.
I think you've now defined another show for us, Mike. We're going to have to come get back together to discuss the need for a constitutional convention, which I think would be
dangerous. It could be dangerous because who knows what the people rewriting that document. But we certainly, it's time to revisit some of the parts.
It is.
Yeah,
I think we can all agree.
I certainly think that's cause for a new show. I want to just throw out one last thing because we are running in time here. Do you think that there can be a just society without an underlying assumption or quality of trust? And is the goal, can we think of a way or suggest ways in which our society can create more trust among our members in order that we can form a more perfect union?
Well, I think the question is, who does that burden fall on? And who has had the disproportionate amount of power and the disproportionate amount of privileges? I think it's incumbent on that group to launch the project and of trust and to live up to promises. I tell my students a lot, boy, this blows away any conversation if you really embrace it. But I talk about how to my students, how African Americans were liberated from slavery, and they don't have a dime in their pocket. They have no land. They say, good luck, you're free.
Yeah.
And all the centuries of unpaid labor, there was never any compensation.
Right.
And African Americans have been trying to dig out of that hole ever since.
Well, we couldn't have won Georgia without the African American.
Right.
Thank God.
You're talking about
Well-
this election now, not the Civil War.
But anyway, during that period of Reconstruction,
Mhm.
there was a chapter of American history there where General Sherman, is still fighting the Confederates, and he's got a lot of freedmen following him for safety and because they don't have any food or anything. And he says, "Oh, look at this land traders abandoned."
Let's
And
get
he gave them 40 acres and a mule. That's a famous thing, right?
Yes.
That's the only time we've ever tried to compensate. We gave reparations to Japanese as we should have.
Yes.
There are financial compensations provided for Native Americans, even though they were the victims of genocide. We haven't really paid back what they've lost, but at least there's some system.
Well, we can go on about that because let's be honest, they are still victims of genocide.
Oh, of course. But if you bring that up to white Americans, and you see that's where it's all linked, because we are in such a fundamentally unfair economy,
Mhm.
getting millions of white people to agree that, well, this is a special case of injustice. This is a much deeper case. We need to redistribute some wealth from the white community. That in the absence of economic justice for white people, broaching the fact that African Americans are owed reparations, it's a very hard case to advance. And in fact, it carries the risk of really ugly backlash. So we have to do these things simultaneously. And, this is a subject our education system has failed. I still have students who think the Civil War was not about slavery. I don't know how long it will take to win.
Well,
A lot of Americans who think the world is flat and that the sun revolves around the earth.
Yeah. So, but I mean, there's so much pressure on public school teachers to be neutral, quote unquote.
mhm.
Which, when you take that stance, there's certain things that are actually true.
Yes.
Neutral about the truth. And they avoid the subjects that are controversial, but I think until that becomes more universal knowledge, we stop worrying about standardized tests and about imparting wisdom, I think that we've got a real problem achieving the goal of justice, and it has to be simultaneously.
Now, you just introduced to me, indirectly, a very important part of this, which we have avoided so far, which is God and religion. Because the reason that teachers have become afraid of teaching often has to do with God and religion. Yes, a lot of the charter schools and the destruction of public education in this country in recent years has been in a large part about race, but much more of it has been about religion. Can you teach science? Can you teach can you teach science in a system where Darwin is still a forbidden word?
Yeah. No, I mean that is an issue. I've even encountered that in college.
Oh yeah, I did as a college teacher.
You're defined as attacking religion, and in my particular college, there's a real issue with seeing the mission of education as not offending anybody. And of course, actually, a lot of the learning happens when you do offend people.
Yeah.
If you're never appalled, shocked, upset, or offended by anything in any subject dealing with history, sociology, anthropology, etc., then you're not learning. You're preparing for a trivia contest. And religion doesn't have to be inherently in conflict with science, I have problems. I grew up Catholic, and I have problems with the Catholic Church and its attitude towards women, and obviously they cover up the wide scale child molestation. But Francis occasionally really hits the nail on the head, and he just recently reaffirmed what John Paul II did, someone I politically disagreed with a lot, saying the Big Bang happened, evolution happened, and he said that God's not a magician. And so, I'm not a believer, but I think, it would be helpful. I think it would be very helpful, because I'm in the Bible Belt. I'm in Texas, the most churched state maybe in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And my students come to the classroom after 12 years of public school, and they're biblically illiterate. They don't understand basic allusions to major figures in the Bible. They don't get allusions to the Sermon on the Mount or the Beatitudes, or the Psalms, or that's all. It's like you might as well be speaking in Martian to bring that up, even though they're surrounded by it. And the fact that we can't teach the history of religion, we can't teach the overlap of the Abrahamic religions, we can't teach about different ethical systems that are still grounded in basic morality, whether it's Hindu or Buddhist or whatever, that there's such a fear of treading on that ground that they lose. I don't know how you understand James Baldwin or Mark Twain or John Steinbeck if you don't understand the biblical references in those works.
Yes, absolutely.
Amen. And with that thought, again, we have not yet more things. We could keep going and discussing, but unfortunately we're about out of time. Celeste, any last brilliant words from you?
No, I'm at the point in my life that I really want to see some changes, and I'd like to have some really good ideas of how to do that with some type of diverse group, and to really look at seriously getting some attention to it, and really making some changes. I do not want my granddaughters coming up in a world that we keep thinking over and over again that we've gotten past some issues. So that's where I'm at right now. I'm all about solutions right now. I'm not about talking. We have talked so many years. There's a lot of good ideas out there. Now it's time to start putting something in action.
And it's a good time to start.
Right. It's a great time right now.
Right.
It is a great time because things are uncomfortable. And as Mike just said, when we're uncomfortable, we actually can change and learn.
Yes.
Too much comfort is not so great. Which brings us back to the Ferlingetti poem I read.
Yes.
Monica, any last thoughts on your part?
No, I just want to thank Michael for coming on our show, because to me, he's brilliant. And he always looks at all sides of things. He does research and he speaks that. Hard to find nowadays.
Well, Monica, I think the thing about us is that we have found over the years been very, very blessed on the show of its earlier form and now this form, that we have managed to find people like Mike who are just great guests. And I'm just hoping that people, please, listeners, this is my spiel, my little ad. There had to be one, right? Tell people, get people to listen to the podcast. Tell them to go to YouTube, share the link, because Celeste, Monica, and I really do put a lot of effort into not only finding great guests like Mike, but also trying to raise topics worth listening and talking about. Mike, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I worry that we have this magic thinking when there's New Year's Eve that something changes, and it's obviously I've joked about us being in the long 2020 that it seems like it's still going on. I was really moved during those social justice protests, those racial justice protests in 2020, during a pandemic. And it does seem like some of the momentum stalled quite a bit.
Yeah.
And it's, I was moved by the fact that it was multiracial, that so many white people participated, but we really need to find a way to get past this short attention span.
Yeah,
Just
it's constant. Absolutely.
Long struggle. And there's so many levels. We have seen a level of authoritarianism, even totalitarianism in our politics. And we need to battle like it's a life or death struggle, because it is.
This might bring us all together quite a bit. It might help.
Yep.
You know, so I am positive about it. We're going to make it happen.
At least the four of us are going to keep trying, right?
Exactly.
Folks, thank you so much for joining us today. And do, keep listening, because Celeste, Monica, and I really do think that we can make a difference if we all just keep sharing our ideas, our writings, our chats, and our friends.
Exactly. And with that, I have a cute little video. Well, I don't know how cute it is, but it's on topic. Thanks a lot, guys.
Bye. Thank you.
justice, a roll